It started like everything else in Huajun Liang's life, with a spreadsheet. 2 years ago, over breakfast and jasmine tea, his mother slid a gold-trimmed folder across the lacquered table. Inside were the profiles of 4 American candidates from an elite matchmaking service. "Think of this as risk management," she said, her tone clipped, diplomatic. "Marriage is the cornerstone of your reputation. You're nearly 30. Investors are watching." Huajun didn't flinch. He hadn't believed in love since he was 24. Not after what happened in Beijing. Love, in his experience, came with fine print and secrets. So he didn't argue. He chose the candidate who seemed the least complicated, Melissa Davenport. Melissa was everything his world required: poised, educated, ethnically ambiguous enough to photograph well beside him. She smiled like she belonged beside a throne. They met in Shanghai over cocktails at a hotel rooftop bar his PR team had rented for the occasion. She wore emerald silk and spoke Mandarin with the practiced confidence of someone who rehearsed in mirrors. "You're exactly as intense as I expected," she'd said with a laugh that was half flirtation, half negotiation. Huajun raised his glass. "And you're exactly as polished." That was enough. There were no butterflies, no spark, just alignment. The headlines did the rest. Chinese billionaire heiress-to-be, a cross-cultural power couple rising. Behind the scenes, Melissa fit into Huajun's world like a pre-cut key. She understood branding, played her role well, and never asked about his late nights or silences. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Strategic, clean, but not warm. Huajun didn't mind. He had stopped expecting warmth. If Melissa was the family's gem, Ivory Monroe was the misfit piece, polished by time but kept tucked away. She lived in a quiet part of Atlanta where she worked as an archival assistant at a Black History museum. She loved records and silence, old letters, and the feel of cotton gloves on crumbling photographs. She rarely appeared at family gatherings. When she did, she stayed in the kitchen, helping staff clean, or escaping onto balconies with a book. Her presence was tolerated, but never requested. Melissa's mother, Ivory's stepmother, rarely introduced her by name. At best, she was the other one. And Melissa? She kept her at arm's length, not cruelly, just with precision. Ivory's different, she'd once told Huajun when he asked about siblings. Bookish, odd, we don't really talk. He never thought to ask more. Why would he? Ivory hadn't planned on attending the wedding. She got the invite 2 weeks late, and only because her father insisted. She didn't fit the theme, didn't fit the dress code, didn't fit the family photo. But Melissa's mother, ever the master of image, insisted at the last minute. "We need to show we're united. You'll be in a few photos. Just smile and keep to the side." So Ivory came. The flight was long. The dress she ordered online didn't arrive. At a boutique near the airport, she picked a pale satin gown from the clearance rack. Simple, elegant, but unbranded. By the time she arrived at the Shanghai hotel, her curls were pinned, her nerves were hidden, and her name wasn't even printed on the seating chart. She was invisible, exactly how they preferred her. She saw Huajun for the first time from a distance, the night before the wedding. He was standing in the marble lobby, tall and severe in a charcoal suit, speaking quietly to his assistant in Mandarin. Ivory didn't stare, but she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way he looked more like a hostage than a groom. Funny, she thought. Even billionaires don't look happy before their weddings. She passed him without a word, and he didn't see her. Not yet. The air inside the ballroom shimmered with wealth. Gold leaf chandeliers glowed overhead, and a gentle aria drifted from the grand piano near the floral arch. Beneath the stained glass ceiling, The elite of Asia's business world sat in crisp tuxedos and haute couture gowns, waiting, whispering. The wedding of Huajun Leang, heir to the Leang consortium, was not just a personal affair. It was a public performance, a strategic alliance, a headline waiting to be carved into the marble of legacy. But something was wrong. Ivory stood off to the side, fingers clutching a silk bouquet that wasn't even hers. Her pewter dress, simple, sleeveless, had no designer label, and compared to the bridesmaids glittering beside her, she looked like a misplaced museum curator. She shouldn't have been there, but she was, and the bride wasn't. The murmurs grew louder. Someone dropped a champagne flute. Huajun's assistant paced behind the velvet curtain, whispering harshly into a Bluetooth earpiece. Ivory glanced at her father, who sat near the back, eyes wide with unease. Her stepmother, Melissa's mother, was pale, lips drawn tight. She walked over to Ivory, yanking her by the wrist. "Have you heard from her?" "What?" Ivory blinked. "No. Don't lie, you're her sister. Don't tell me she didn't say something to you." Ivory pulled her arm free. "We haven't spoken in weeks." Her stepmother hissed, "Then find her, or this family will burn in front of China's elite." Huajun stood alone at the altar, still, imposing, the embodiment of controlled rage. An aide approached him, whispered something. Huajun didn't move. Then, slowly, his dark eyes turned toward the audience, and the silence became deafening. Ivory stepped inside the suite. The veil lay on the bed. The shoes were gone. The diamond-studded gown was still zipped up in its silk casing, untouched. There was only a note on the vanity, torn paper, a single line in Melissa's familiar, sharp handwriting. "Tell Huajun I couldn't do it. I won't live in a cage." Huajun read the note in silence. His jaw twitched once, only once, before he folded it and slid it into his breast pocket. His mother had already begun whispering to the chairman of the Goldstone Media. Cameras were being redirected. Guests were growing impatient. "I'll issue a statement," one aide suggested. "Blame illness or sabotage." "No," Huajun said flatly. "There will be no scandal." He turned to Melissa's mother. "Do you have another daughter?" Her eyes flinched. "That's ridiculous. She's not suitable." "I asked a question," Huajun said. His voice was low, but it carried enough weight to silence the room. Ivory was frozen behind the curtain. She heard her name mentioned, and when he turned to her, really looked at her for the first time, her breath caught. "You," Huajun said. Ivory blinked. "Me?" He stepped closer. The heat of the moment, the fury, the shame, it all radiated off him like steam from fire-forged steel. "You're her sister, same family name. That's enough. Walk down that aisle, now." Ivory's heart pounded in her ears. "You can't be serious." "I am," he said. "This wedding will happen, with or without her." She shook her head. "You don't even know me." "Good," he said coldly. "I prefer strangers to liars." Papers were pulled out of a leather folder. "Sign here," said a man in a gray suit. "We'll clean up the registration later. Right now, we need a signature." Ivory stared down at the marriage license. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. "I'm not Melissa," she whispered. "I'm aware," Huajun replied. "But you're here, and that's all that matters now." Ivory looked up. His expression wasn't cruel, just determined, wounded, dangerous. She looked back at the ink and signed. The music played again. The lights refocused. Ivory stepped out beneath the arch, alone, her heels clicking against the marble like an echo of someone else's dream. Huajun stood at the altar, unreadable. She took his arm. Cameras flashed, and in the hush that followed, as two strangers said, "I do," before a room full of power brokers, her name changed forever. Ivory Monroe became Ivory Leang. Not for love, not for legacy, but for survival. She stared at the nameplate on the door. Mrs. Ivory Leang. Etched in gold against smooth rosewood, it gleamed like something sacred, permanent, belonging. But the woman staring at it, the woman holding her breath just beyond its frame, felt like an intruder. Ivory reached for the door handle with the fingers that still shook when no one was watching. Inside, the bedroom was elegant to the point of intimidation. A carved canopy bed, silk drapes in pale jade, a vanity stocked with cosmetics she didn't know how to pronounce, a walk-in closet larger than her old studio apartment in Atlanta. It was a room designed for Melissa. Ivory's suitcase sat near the bathroom door, still zipped. No one had offered to unpack it. Hwa-jun had not stayed the night. He hadn't said where he was going after the reception. He hadn't touched her hand since that staged kiss in front of the press. Hadn't looked her in the eye when the priest asked if he would cherish her. "This isn't love," he told her in private. "Good," she'd whispered. "Then I won't expect it." They hadn't spoken since. The breakfast table was long enough to host a board meeting. Ivory sat at the far end with a porcelain teacup she was too nervous to drink from. Hwa-jun sat several seats down, already scrolling through financial reports. A servant poured him oolong tea, no milk. He didn't look up. The staff moved around him like planets around a fixed sun. Precise, controlled. Ivory was invisible again. "Would you like..." She started to ask a maid for more hot water. The woman turned and walked away before she could finish. Hwa-jun's eyes flicked up. "They weren't briefed on you." Ivory swallowed. "I noticed." He set his tablet down. "That will change once it's finalized." Finalized? The contract, the restructuring. There's paperwork to make you official on the domestic registry. "Oh, of course. Because nothing says wife like a back-end merger filing." He looked at her, mildly surprised. "I didn't know sarcasm was part of your vocabulary." "You don't know much about me," she said softly, "except that I was available." A beat of silence. Then he stood. "You'll receive a schedule by noon. Mandarin tutoring, cultural etiquette, wardrobe fittings. There's a dinner this week. Leang Group executives and wives. You'll need to attend." She blinked. "Wives?" "They'll expect to see you. Play the role. Say little. Smile. You know the type." Ivory didn't respond because, yes, she knew the type. She'd lived her whole life being measured against one. Ivory wore a black off-shoulder gown, chosen by a stylist who hadn't even asked her size, just handed over 3 options with tags still on. Her hair was slicked into a low bun. Gold earrings dangled beside her jaw like miniature knives. As she entered the drawing room, conversations paused, then resumed at a lower pitch. The wives of the Leang board members sipped imported wine, their designer handbags perched like trophies beside them. One of them, Madame Wei, offered a smile as sharp as a paper cut. "You're Melissa's sister, yes? What an unusual outcome." "Unusual seems to follow me," Ivory replied, voice cool. Another woman leaned in. "Did you know about the switch beforehand? Or was it as surprising to you as it was to the rest of China?" Ivory gripped her clutch. "Life doesn't always wait for your consent," she said. "But sometimes it hands you a name, and you either wear it with your head down or lift your chin and own it." The women went quiet. Hwa-jun, standing across the room, had been watching. He said nothing, but for the first time, his expression shifted, a flicker of interest. 7 years ago, Ivory stood outside the dressing room, holding a lint roller and a pair of Melissa's heels. She was supposed to help prep Melissa for her debutante photo shoot. Her stepmother adjusted the train of Melissa's white gown and turned to Ivory, her tone dismissive. "Don't bother trying, Ivory," she said, not unkindly, just honestly. "You're not the star of this family." Melissa had giggled behind her hand. Ivory hadn't cried, but she'd never forgotten. Ivory sat on the balcony of her new bedroom, barefoot, her dress draped over the armrest beside her. The city lights pulsed in silence, skyscrapers blinking like indifferent gods. She hadn't seen Hua-jun since the dinner. He hadn't commented on her presence, or her silence, or her steel. She stared at the gold nameplate on the edge of the envelope she was given earlier. Mrs. Ivory Leang, primary spouse, official consort, not placeholder, but not partner either, somewhere in between. "I don't want this," she whispered to the night, "but I'll survive it." She always had. And for the first time, she felt the cold thrill of something new rising in her blood. Not love, not hope, but resolve. It's been months since she became Mrs. Ling, and nothing has changed. The door creaked softly as Hua-jun pushed it open. Ivory stood just behind him, her heels clicking against the marble floor until they reached the slate of the rooftop steps. She expected steel, concrete, maybe a helipad. What she didn't expect was greenery. A rooftop garden, hidden several stories above the city, stretched out like a secret Eden beneath the stars. Bamboo rustled along the edges. Lanterns, small, round, softly lit, hung from wooden arches. A single bonsai tree sat on a stone pedestal, its limbs twisted into quiet poetry. Hua-jun walked ahead, loosening the top button of his shirt, the tension falling from his frame in pieces. He moved like someone returning to himself. "This is..." Ivory paused. "This is yours?" He didn't turn around. "No one else comes here." She took slow steps past the bonsai and stopped at a small wooden bench nestled between two planters of jasmine and white peonies. The scent was delicate, alive. She inhaled like she'd forgotten to breathe for days. "You don't seem like the gardening type," she murmured. Hua-jun picked up a small silver watering can from a shelf, shaking it slightly before pouring water into a tray under the bonsai. "You assume I'm made of glass and money," he replied. "I don't blame you." Ivory didn't answer. She lowered herself onto the bench and folded her hands in her lap. The silence between them stretched, but unlike the cold walls of the estate, this silence breathed. "Melissa hated this place," he said after a moment. "She came up here once, complained the air was too thick, said it made her hair frizz." Ivory let out a small breath, half scoff, half exhale. "I guess I'm more tolerant of frizz." That startled something like a smile from him. Barely there, but real. He sat down on a low stool across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "You're nothing like her." Ivory raised an eyebrow. Was that meant to be a compliment? "Observation," he said, then added, more softly, "But yes, one I don't regret." She looked away, eyes finding the lantern swinging gently in the breeze. "I never tried to be like her," she said, "though it didn't stop people from comparing us." "You're quieter," he said. "I had to be," she replied. "She filled every room. There was never space left for me to be loud." He studied her then. Not the way a man looks at a beautiful woman, but the way a man listens to someone he's never truly seen before. "Why did you say yes?" he asked. "To the marriage?" He nodded. Ivory's fingers tightened slightly around her own wrist. "Because your world would have devoured my father's reputation if I didn't." "Not the marriage," she added quietly. "The shame, the headlines, the humiliation. I figured I could carry some of it." "Why?" he pressed. "You owed nothing. Maybe not to you, but I owed it to myself, not to walk away from a fire without at least trying to put it out. There was something ancient in the silence that followed. Hwa-jun stood slowly and walked toward the peony bush. His fingers brushed one bloom. Careful, reverent. I plant things, he said, because most of my life is about control. Deadlines, numbers. But these, he gestured to the petals. You can't force them to bloom. You just wait. You tend. You learn patience. Ivory tilted her head, watching him through a softer lens. So you come up here to lose control? No, he said. I come here to remember that control isn't everything. The wind picked up again. Ivory's curls brushed her cheek, loose from the clip she wore at dinner. She tucked them behind her ear. Hwa-jun looked at her again, closer this time. Not with curiosity, not with calculation, but with recognition. I misjudged you, he said. Everyone does. No, he said. Most people don't even try. I'm the one who decided you were furniture in someone else's story. I didn't think you had fire in you. I didn't know I did either, she whispered. Not until you lit the match. He didn't answer that, but he sat beside her now, not across, not apart. They didn't speak again for a long time. They simply sat, among the peonies, beneath the stars, in the soft hush of a garden made for secrets. And for the first time since they'd said I do, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a beginning. Ivory could feel the stares the moment they stepped out of the car. The paparazzi's cameras didn't linger on her. They flashed, paused, then hurried past to capture a more familiar face. A fashion heiress, a television star, a retired actress with skin like lacquer and diamonds like apology. Ivory adjusted her silk wrap and walked a half step behind Hwa-jun, just as she'd been told. Not too close, not too fast. Be graceful, be unbothered, be ornamental, like Melissa would have been. Inside the ballroom, everything gleamed. Crystal chandeliers, gilded paneling, string quartets tucked into alcoves of imported orchids. The air smelled like power, aged wine, new money, and old secrets. Ivory stood by the marble-topped bar, alone, sipping sparkling water through a silver straw. She wore a sapphire gown, high neckline, slit at the side, that had been picked by a stylist who only spoke Mandarin and approval ratings. The dress hugged her curves beautifully, but she still felt like a guest in someone else's skin. That's her, someone whispered behind a fan. The one who replaced Melissa Davenport, the stand-in bride. Oh, she's lovely, just not the usual pedigree. I heard she works in a museum. Something to do with dusty books. Not even Ivy League. Ivory turned away before the heat in her chest could rise to her face. She wasn't new to whispers, but these were knives. Hwa-jun, across the room, was speaking with a group of executives. He glanced over briefly, giving her a nod of acknowledgement. Not warmth, not affection, just, you're holding your place. Good. She took another sip and breathed in deep. Madame Ruo, the evening's hostess and wife of the Qingxi group chairman, approached in a floor-length champagne gown that glittered like frost. She was famous for being merciless in conversation. She stopped in front of Ivory with a smile that was more weapon than welcome. Mrs. Leang, she purred, you're even more radiant than the tabloid suggested. It's brave, truly, stepping into a role like this. So, unexpectedly. Ivory blinked. Unexpected for whom? Well, we all knew Melissa, of course. She was practically raised to marry into legacy. But you, well, no one had heard of you until the wedding. It's like finding a wildflower in a vase of orchids. Several nearby women stifled polite laughs. Ivory's hand tightened around her glass. She could hear Melissa's voice in her head. Snide, triumphant. You'll always be the footnote, Ivy. Even if you marry a king, they'll see you as the plus one. But something rose in her. Not rage, not shame. Something cleaner, clearer, resolve. She smiled at Madame Rouault, gentle but unmistakable. Wildflowers don't ask for permission to grow, she said. They bloom where no one thought to plant them. The laughter stopped. Madame Rouault tilted her head, but Ivory didn't look away. And sometimes, Ivory added, her voice steady, it's the wildflowers that survive the storms, not the orchids. A pause. Then, touché, Madame Rouault said with a faint nod. Perhaps there's more to you than rumor allows. Ivory offered a delicate bow and walked away. He had seen it all. From the edge of the room, wine glass still in hand, Huajun watched her glide back into the crowd with grace that no name could give, and no pedigree could teach. The way she stood her ground, the intelligence behind her calm, the restraint behind her fire. And for the first time since their wedding, Huajun felt a flicker of something dangerously unfamiliar. Pride, curiosity, interest. She was not Melissa. She was not a placeholder. She was someone entirely her own. 8 years ago, 14-year-old Ivory sat outside the ballroom of the Saint Clair Hotel in a rental car. Through the tall windows, she could see the chandeliers glowing above the marble dance floor, where girls in tulle gowns twirled beneath silk banners. At the center of it all was Melissa, radiant in white, arms looped with some senator's son, the center of every lens. Ivory wore a borrowed dress. Her hair had frizzed from the rain. She clutched a corsage meant for a dinner that never came. Inside, her father gave a speech. Her stepmother clapped. Her name was never mentioned. She waited in the parking lot for 2 hours, then walked home in her heels. Later, back at the estate, Ivory sat outside her room, shawl draped over her shoulders. The city shimmered below like melted stars. She heard footsteps behind her. Huajun, you handled that well tonight, he said. Better than I expected. She didn't look at him. You expected me to fold? No, he said. I expected you to disappear. Ivory turned. I've disappeared my whole life, Mr. Leang. I'm done with that. He studied her. I'm not easy company. I didn't marry you for ease. A pause. Why did you agree to marry me then? She smiled, sad and steady. Because for once, the door wasn't locked, and I got to walk through it, not as someone's shadow, but as myself. Even if it led to a cage, then I'll bloom through the bars. He didn't respond, but his eyes didn't leave hers. Something unspoken passed between them. Not yet love, but something with weight. And beneath the sky, with glass and jasmine between them, Ivory realized she no longer needed to be someone else's reflection. She was beginning to cast her own light. Rain had passed earlier in the evening. The stones beneath Ivory's feet were still damp, the air perfumed with petrichor and plum blossoms. Lanterns swayed above her head, warm with low amber light. She didn't come here for peace, not tonight. She came to confront the quiet, to find something real in a world of marble facades and polite avoidance. And there he was, Huajun, kneeling beside the bonsai tree with his sleeves rolled, his tie discarded, hands buried in dark soil. I didn't expect you, he said without turning. I didn't expect to come, Ivory replied, but this place is the only thing in your world that doesn't lie. He paused, then glanced at her over his shoulder. And you've been in my world long enough to tell? She walked to the edge of the planter box, brushing her fingertips against a damp peony bloom. Long enough to know this marriage wasn't made for breathing room. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his palms with an elegance that somehow made the gesture seem royal. You're not wrong, he said, tone low. This wasn't meant to feel like anything. Does it? She asked. Feel? He met her gaze. Sometimes, in moments. She looked away before he could see too much. That's more than I expected. He gestured to the wooden bench and she sat. He joined her this time, not with the distance of a CEO beside a stranger, but with the quiet of a man beside a woman he wasn't sure how to stop noticing. There's a reason I didn't love Melissa, he said softly. It wasn't just her. She waited. Before her, there was someone else, in university. She wasn't from a powerful family. She wasn't ambitious. She was kind, gentle. We were close. His voice carried the weight of a confession he hadn't spoken in years. I thought she understood me, that she saw who I was beneath the business suits and projections and family legacy. Ivory watched the tension build in his jaw. She sold me out, he continued, to a rival company, fed them details from our private conversations. I lost a patent. My father lost trust in me. That trust was never rebuilt. Ivory whispered, That's why you built a wall. No, he said. That's when I realized the wall was already there. I just stopped pretending I didn't need it. She let his silence settle like dust around them. Then she spoke. When I first heard Melissa was marrying a Chinese billionaire, I didn't ask who, Ivory said, voice low. I assumed it was just another transaction. Hua-jun looked at her. She didn't look away. And then I saw your face in a magazine, she continued. Your eyes. I remembered them. From where? That one gala in New York. You shook my father's hand. You never saw me. But I saw you. He blinked, quiet now. And for a moment, she said, her voice thinning, I wished I were her, just so you might turn your head. He sat back, stunned. I loved you once, quietly, when it was safe, because no one saw me anyway. Ivory. I wasn't the plan, she added, her throat tight. I wasn't supposed to be in this world, or this marriage. I'm only here because she ran. She stood as if trying to remove herself from the weight of it all. You don't owe me anything, Hua-jun. I know that. I just needed to say it once, to someone who might not use it against me. He rose to his feet slowly, walked toward her, and stopped inches away. You weren't the plan, he said. That's true. She nodded, staring at the stone tiles between them. Then he lifted her chin with a hand rougher than she expected. You're the correction. Her breath caught. You're what this should have been all along, he said. Not polished, not strategic, just honest and mine. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Not when her eyes spoke louder than words. That night, they didn't kiss, but they stood beneath the lanterns in the night sky, no longer strangers, no longer shadows. And for the first time, Ivory didn't feel like she was stealing someone else's life. She felt like she was finally standing in her own. The night was unusually still. No city hum, no wind brushing the lanterns above. Just a soft hush, like the world had paused its breath. Ivory stood by the stone railing of the rooftop garden, her bare shoulders warmed by the amber glow of the lanterns. A shawl rested loosely around her elbows, but she barely noticed the chill. Below her, the city of Shanghai sparkled like 1,000 unsent letters. Beautiful, distant, untouchable. Just like everything else in her life, until now. Behind her, she heard footsteps, measured and unhurried. She didn't turn. You always come here when the world's too loud, Hua-jun said. And you? She asked softly. When do you come? He stopped beside her, hands in his pockets. When I want to hear something honest. She looked at him then. He wore no tie. His shirt was open at the collar, his hair slightly tousled. There were shadows beneath his eyes, but a softness too, like something had finally unclenched inside him. "You left a board dinner for this," she said, almost smiling. "The food was terrible," he replied, "and the conversation worse." He turned toward her fully, eyes searching hers. "But the truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said last week." Ivory's gaze dropped to the lantern-lit tiles between them. "I meant it," she whispered, "every word." "I know," he said, "and I've been trying to figure out how to answer you." He stepped back just slightly and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Ivory stilled. When he pulled out the box, her breath caught. It was deep velvet, no logo, just the faintest gold seam along the lid. He opened it. Inside was the ring. Ivory's heart twisted. She never wore it," Hwa-jun said gently. "She didn't want anything she couldn't post before the press embargo. It sat in a drawer for months." He took it out slowly, the diamond catching the lantern light like it finally had something worth shining for. "I didn't give it to her," he continued. "I showed it to her. That's all it ever was. A placeholder, like everything else we did." He took a breath, and then, without ceremony, without fanfare, he lowered himself to one knee. Not as a performance, not as a photo op, but as a man who was finally choosing. "Ivory Monroe Leang," he said, voice steady but thick. "Let's begin again." Her lips parted, but no words came. "Not as a contract," he added. "Not because we were forced, not because the cameras are watching." "They're not," she whispered, barely audible. "Good," he said, "because this time, it's not about them, it's about you." He held the ring up. "I see you now," he said. "I feel you. And if you'll let me, I want to build something real. Not just for the empire, not just for the name, but for us." Ivory couldn't stop the tears. Not the loud, gasping kind, but the kind that slipped quietly, gently, like her soul had been waiting to exhale for years. She lowered herself to her knees, facing him. "You know this wasn't how girls like me were raised to dream," she said through a trembling smile. "There was never a fairy tale, just survival, just invisibility." Hwa-jun reached for her hand. "Then let this be your rewrite," he said. She nodded, laughing softly through the tears. "Only if we write it together." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been waiting for her all along. They stayed there for a moment, two people kneeling before no altar but the stars. And then he leaned in. No press, no photographers, no board members, staff, or scheming mothers. Just a man and a woman. And a kiss that felt like the beginning of everything. Their lips met, slow, reverent, no rush, no proving. Ivory closed her eyes as his hand brushed her cheek, as he pulled her just a little closer, like she was something fragile but real. Something he chose to hold. And she kissed him back, not with the desperation of a woman begging to be seen, but with the quiet power of someone who finally was. That night, they didn't speak again. They simply held hands, sat in the garden, and listened to the silence breathe around them. And this time, for the first time, the silence between them was full of belonging. The guard's voice was hesitant over the intercom. "Sir, there's a woman at the gate. She says her name is Melissa Davenport." Ivory froze mid-sip of her tea. Across the breakfast table, Hwa-jun set down his chopsticks with the quiet deliberation of a man slipping into old armor. He stood, jaw tightening. The gate camera feed flickered onto the screen beside the table. There she was, Melissa, hair glossier than ever, lips painted the same wine-red shade she'd worn for engagement shoots. dressed in cream like she had every right to wear white again. But it was her eyes that caught Ivory, their stillness, not desperate, not regretful, just cold. Ivory stood beside Hwajun as the gates opened. Melissa stepped forward, chin lifted, heels silent on the stones. "Well," she said, "no welcoming committee?" "Why are you here?" Hwajun asked, tone carved from steel. Melissa's gaze flicked to Ivory. She offered a tight smile. "Don't worry, I'm not here to claw back my ring." Ivory folded her arms, grounding herself. "Then what do you want?" "The truth," Melissa said, "and a little dignity." She reached into her bag, pulling out a worn envelope. "I never wanted to leave, you know, but your mother gave me a reason." Hwajun's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "She threatened me," Melissa said. "Said she'd ruin my career, leak fake pregnancy rumors, freeze every account my agency depended on. Said marrying into this family required a certain pedigree, and mine had too many cracks." "And you're only telling us now?" Ivory asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Because I was stupid." She handed Hwajun the envelope. "I kept the message. Her threats? Proof. I thought you'd want to know what your family is capable of." Hwajun took the letter without a word. Melissa turned, gave them both one last look, and walked away with that same composed, deliberate grace that had once made her unshakable. "She's lying," Hwajun said flatly. "About her name?" Ivory asked. "About why she ran." The envelope sat unopened on Hwajun's desk. Ivory didn't ask why. Something felt wrong. Too practiced, too clean. The next day, photos began to surface. Old ones, Melissa and Hwajun in Tokyo, laughing in a cafe. A candid from the engagement party, Hwajun smiling at her as she fixed his collar. A blurred photo of Melissa curled asleep in his lap on a private jet. The captions were cruel. Mrs. Leang wasn't always the bride. The real fiancé returns. Is Hwajun Leang still in love? Ivory scrolled through the images on her phone, her throat dry. She didn't remember ever seeing him look that relaxed, that fond. She hated herself for noticing. Ivory stood in the doorway, phone in hand. "They're everywhere," she said. "Those photos, those moments." Hwajun didn't look up from his desk. "They're from years ago. But they look like now." That got his attention. "Ivory, I know it's not your fault," she said quickly, eyes bright with something brittle. "But she's here, and she's beautiful, and she fits, and the world already believes you belong to her." He crossed the room in 3 swift strides and stopped in front of her. "No," he said firmly. "They think she belongs because they haven't seen you take your place yet." Ivory's voice was barely a whisper. "What if I don't know how?" "Then let me show you." "Hwajun, Her breath hitched. "I feel like I'm disappearing again, like I'm 14 and invisible and watching someone else be chosen. Again." His eyes softened. "You are not invisible to me, Ivory." "But I don't have a history with you," she said, finally voicing the fear that had hollowed her chest for months. "I wasn't your first. I wasn't even your second. I was just..." "You were the first person to see me," he said, cutting in. "Not the air, not the brand, just me." She looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't just angry or burdened. He was afraid too. Afraid of losing what they were just beginning to build. He reached for her hand. "Let them whisper," he said. "Let them scroll. Let her haunt the headlines. But you're the woman I come home to. You're the reason I stopped surviving and started feeling again." A long breath passed between them. Then she leaned into him, not for reassurance, but for grounding. And for the first time since Melissa's return, Ivory allowed herself to believe. Maybe love didn't need a perfect beginning. Maybe it just needed the right now. Ivory wasn't supposed to be there. The Chengxi Art Council had invited her to a luncheon, her first solo event as Mrs. Leang. But the skies opened midway, forcing half the guests indoors and scattering the rest into nearby rooms. That's how she found herself standing outside a conference suite, dripping umbrella in hand, when she heard the sound of Melissa's laugh echo down the marble corridor. She turned. There they were, Hua-jun and Melissa, alone in the corner of a wide glass room, not touching, not smiling, but too close. Melissa's hand lingered at the edge of his sleeve. Her expression was unreadable, pleading, charming, familiar. Hua-jun stood still, unreadable as ever, but not leaving, and that silence between them, that dangerous, intimate silence, cut deeper than words ever could. Ivory didn't move. She watched for several seconds, each one louder than the last. Then she turned and walked away. The sky outside had bruised into a deep indigo, but Ivory stood by the window, wrapped in a robe, watching droplets streak the glass like unanswered questions. She hadn't spoken since she returned. Hua-jun came in just after 9, his steps quiet, as if unsure whether to announce himself. "You saw us," he said simply. She didn't turn. "Yes." "I wasn't hiding it." "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what made it worse." He moved closer, stopped a few paces behind her. "She called me, said she wanted to meet. I didn't agree right away, but she showed up anyway." Ivory turned then, eyes glistening, shoulders trembling. "And you stayed?" He hesitated. "Yes." She stared at him, something breaking just beneath her ribs. "Do you love her?" she asked, and this time the words weren't controlled. They cracked, trembled, bled. He flinched, just barely, but enough to show the wound went both ways. "No," he said, and stepped closer. "But I think she's drowning." Ivory blinked, confused. "Drowning?" "She's unraveling," he said quietly. "I see it in her eyes. The need to reclaim something, to not feel replaced. She's not in love with me, but she's terrified of being irrelevant." "And what are you trying to be?" Ivory whispered. "Her lifeboat?" He exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to stop her without breaking her further." "That's not your responsibility, Hua-jun." "Maybe not, but I was once her future." Ivory's throat closed. "And I'm your what?" she asked, voice shaking. "A distraction? A mistake you made public?" "No, you are..." "No!" She stepped back. "Don't say anything unless it's a choice. Not pity, not guilt, not because you feel responsible for every woman who ever loved you." A silence passed between them, thick and aching. Ivory crossed the room, slipped on her shoes. "Where are you going?" he asked, softer now. "To sleep somewhere I'm not an afterthought," she said. Atlanta 10 years ago. A 16-year-old Ivory stood at the top of the staircase in her father's home, dressed in a soft yellow gown. Below, Melissa twirled for guests in diamonds and silk, holding court at her graduation party. Ivory had been told to stay upstairs. "Too plain," her stepmother had said. "Let her have the spotlight." So Ivory stood behind the railing, clutching the hem of her dress, watching her sister be adored, and whispered to herself, "One day, someone will look at me like that." But even now, years later, married, titled, dressed in silk, she wasn't sure it would ever be true. She returned to the only place that ever felt like hers. Barefoot, arms wrapped around her chest, she walked between the peonies and lanterns, letting the cool wind steal the heat from her cheeks, She didn't cry. She had done enough of that in her life. Instead, she sat on the bench, closed her eyes, and whispered to the stars above, "I love him, and maybe that's my mistake." Somewhere inside, Hwa-jun stared at the closed door she'd left behind. He could still feel her voice echoing in his chest. And for the first time in his carefully controlled world, he wasn't sure if love alone was enough to keep her. The night shimmered in diamonds and tension. Held annually, the Golden Lotus Gala was China's most watched philanthropic event. Part charity, part performance, and all politics. This year, it was broadcast live to a viewing audience in the millions. And Ivory Leang was expected to stand beside her husband, smile for the cameras, and say very little. She had done so before, but not this time. The news broke mid-morning. The ghost bride scandal. Melissa Davenport was threatened by Leang matriarch. Leaked letter confirms. The story spread like wildfire. An anonymous reporter with verified documentation, voice memos, and matching handwriting. Marrying that girl will destroy us. Melissa is attractive, but she's temporary. Do not shame our bloodline. The quotes were chilling. And Ivory's name was mentioned in them all. As less than, as stand-in, as acceptable collateral. Within hours, hashtag surged, hashtag let Ivory speak, hashtag Leang bride truth, hashtag more than a replacement. The media stormed the gala steps before the first flute of champagne was poured. Hwa-jun stared at the screen. His mother's face flashed across a dozen panels, each headline more damning than the last. He hadn't known, and that's what gutted him most. Ivory stood beside him, perfectly composed in a black silk gown with silver embroidery curling up the sleeves like vines. Her eyes were unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he said. She met his gaze. "Don't I?" He reached for her hand. "Let me protect you." "You've protected me enough," she said softly. "Now let me protect myself." The chandeliers sparkled like fire trapped in glass. Executives, celebrities, ambassadors. Hwa-jun stepped forward first, as planned, flanked by his PR team. But murmurs surged. Reporters rose from their seats. One called out, bold and sharp, "Mr. Leang, did your mother threaten your former fiancé? Was your current wife chosen out of pity or scandal control? Does Ivory Leang have anything to say?" A pause. Attention. Cameras swiveled. And from the side of the stage, Ivory stepped forward. Alone. The room hushed. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she walked to the podium, gown sweeping behind her like shadow and silk. She reached the microphone, stared out over the glittering sea of eyes, and took one breath, then spoke. "I was never meant to be here." Her voice was quiet, steady, no music behind her, no flashing lights, just truth. "I wasn't invited to the first ceremony. I wasn't the daughter they displayed. I wasn't the bride they chose. I didn't fit the mold. I didn't fit the legacy. But I stayed. I endured. I listened. I learned." The room was dead silent now. And somewhere between headlines and rumors, love bloomed. Not perfectly, not on schedule, but honestly. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't blink them away. "I won't explain the family I married into. I won't pretend the past didn't wound me. But I will say this." She looked directly into the cameras now, the millions watching. "I won't apologize for the light I've found. Even if it started in someone else's shadow, it's mine now. I am Mrs. Leang, not by accident, not by emergency, but by choice, by fire, by growth." There was a heartbeat of silence, then a second, and then applause. First polite, then louder, then thunderous. Reporters stood, guests stood, Hwajun stood. And for the first time in her life, Ivory didn't shrink. She glowed. Later, that night, Hwajun found her standing in the moonlight, arms folded loosely across her waist, still in the gown that now carried 1,000 reposts. He didn't say anything at first. He simply wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You didn't just speak," he whispered. "You roared." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "I was terrified." "You didn't show it." "That's what I learned in the shadows." He kissed her temple gently. "Come out of them then," he said. "Stay in the light, with me." She turned in his arms, forehead against his chest. "I want to believe this is real." "Then let me show you," he murmured. "Every day, every way." And she let him. Weeks later, in a quiet tea house in the French concession, one mid-afternoon, the rain had come without warning. Not a storm, just the kind of gentle, misty drizzle that made the red lanterns outside the windows blur into soft halos. Ivory sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of ginger tea that had long gone lukewarm. She didn't know why she agreed to meet Melissa. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was closure, or maybe, just maybe, she was tired of carrying a wound with no name. Melissa arrived 15 minutes late, wrapped in a camel coat, umbrella in one hand, oversized sunglasses in the other. Even now, she was flawless, but not intimidating, not anymore. "You look well," Melissa said, pulling out the chair across from her. Ivory tilted her head. "Considering you nearly blew up my life 14 months ago?" "Point taken," Melissa muttered, setting her things down. "I didn't come to defend myself." Ivory said nothing. A waiter approached. Melissa waved him off. "Just water." She sat back and stared at her sister. Truly stared. For once, not like she was looking through her, or past her, but at her. "I left that day," Melissa began, "not because I was noble or selfless, not because your husband's mother scared me, not even because I didn't want to marry him." Ivory's fingers curled around her teacup. Melissa swallowed. "I left because I was pregnant." Ivory blinked, slowly. Melissa continued. "I found out 2 weeks before the wedding. It wasn't Hwajun's. It was someone I thought I loved, an investor, a much older man." I panicked. "Why not just tell someone?" Ivory asked, barely above a whisper. Melissa gave a hollow laugh. "Tell mother? So she could have the abortion booked before breakfast? Tell Hwajun? Ruin the alliance? Embarrass the family?" She shook her head. "I told myself I was saving everyone. But the truth is, I was just afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of becoming small." "And now?" Ivory asked. "What are you afraid of now?" Melissa's eyes softened. "That I already lost everything. And the person I used to step over somehow built something real from the wreckage I left behind." Silence hung between them like thick fog. Then Melissa reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. "His name is Mateo. He's 6 months old. Lives with his father in Copenhagen. I'm not with them, but I visit. I'm trying to be better." Ivory took the envelope but didn't open it. Melissa's voice trembled slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to hear me say it." Ivory looked at her fully now, without envy, without comparison, without need. "Say what?" Melissa's eyes brimmed. "I took everything from you, the light, the chances, the space, but somehow you found more." A beat passed. Then, "And I'm sorry, Ivory. I'm so sorry." For a moment, Ivory said nothing. Her hands were still, her breath steady. And then, Wordlessly, she stood, walked around the table, and pulled Melissa into a hug. It wasn't out of love, not quite, but out of release, out of the need to unburden herself from a lifetime of being second, being silent, being small. And in that embrace, Ivory felt something leave her. Not pain, not memory, but permission to move forward. "Take care of yourself," Ivory whispered, "and take care of him." Melissa nodded against her shoulder. "I will." Ivory returned home in silence. Hwajun was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, eyes searching hers. "How did it go?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Better than I thought." "And you?" "Lighter." He walked up to her, brushing damp strands from her cheek. "You didn't have to meet her." "I did," she replied. "Not for her. For me." He nodded, then took her hand, pulling her gently into his arms. "You've been through so much," he whispered, "and yet, here you are, stronger, softer, still standing." She leaned into him. "I'm not standing alone." And as the rain kissed the windows, and two hearts stood side by side in the hush of redemption, Ivory knew she would never be second again. Not to Melissa, not to fear, not to history. She was her own woman now, and her story was just beginning. There was no wind tonight, just a deep, waiting stillness. The sky above Shanghai was unusually clear, stars blinking through the fog as if curious. The city below continued its ceaseless rhythm. But up here, in the rooftop garden carved from stone and memory, everything felt like a pause between heartbeats. Ivory sat on the wooden bench where so much had already happened. Her silence, her survival, her first kiss, her voice. The petals from the plum blossoms had begun to fall, dotting the floor around her like a quiet celebration of endings and beginnings. She heard him approach before she saw him. No bodyguard, no assistant, no designer coat. Just Hwajun, in a black sweater and dark slacks, sleeves rolled, heart on display. He stopped a few feet from her, hands in his pockets, eyes shadowed and bright. "I thought I'd find you here." "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I had to," he replied, "because I need to say this, where everything started to matter." She looked at him then, not as the heir, not as the man the world envied, but as her husband, flawed, finally honest, and standing without a script. He sat beside her, not touching, but close enough to feel it. "When I married you," Hwajun began, "I didn't believe in love." She nodded. She knew. "I believed in image, numbers, negotiation. I believed in survival." A pause. "So I used you," he said. "I needed a solution. And you were a solution." He didn't look at her. Not yet. But she didn't flinch. She waited. "What I didn't expect," he went on, "was for the solution to change me, to confront me, to challenge me, to see me." He turned now, eyes raw. "I never expected to be saved by you." Ivory felt her throat tighten, but she didn't cry. Not this time. She reached for his hand, and when he didn't pull away, she interlaced her fingers with his. "Then choose me," she said, voice low but steady. "Not because it's convenient, not because the scandal's past, not because I stood in when she ran." He turned fully toward her now. Every line of his face softened, broken open. "Choose me," she whispered, "because you want me, because I make you feel more than safe. I make you feel alive." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. And when Hwajun leaned in, it wasn't with haste or heat. It was with reverence. "I choose you," he said against her lips, "not to fix my image, not to replace anyone, but because I've never been more myself than when I'm with you." And then he kissed her, slow, certain, like a man who had once been lost in legacy and finally found home in a woman. They didn't speak much after. They changed out of their evening clothes, brushed their teeth side by side in silence, and crawled into the massive bed that had once felt like a stage. Tonight, it felt like a refuge. Ivory curled beside him, her head resting on his chest, fingers tracing lazy circles along the hem of his shirt. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now?" He pressed a kiss to her hair. "We begin again. No cameras, no contracts, no expectations," he added. "Only us." She smiled into his skin. "Then let's begin." And in the soft hush of their shared breath, of all the things they'd been and all they'd shed, two people fell into something not perfect, but finally real. 1 year later, it was dusk, the kind of dusk that turns everything golden, where time slows and the air holds its breath like it knows something sacred is about to happen. The rooftop garden had been transformed, but not overly so. There were no velvet ropes, no spotlighted ice sculptures, no camera crews, just soft lanterns strung overhead, white petals scattered like snow across the stone floor, and a narrow aisle lined with small, fragrant peonies, Ivory's favorite. Only a handful of guests were present, not power brokers, not press, just people who mattered. And at the center of it all stood Ivory Monroe Leang, wearing a custom ivory gown crafted just for her. No hand-me-down, no borrowed designer names, just silk that moved like breath and detail that whispered of who she truly was. Strong, soft, sacred. The bodice was stitched with subtle vines, hand-embroidered over months, and the train shimmered faintly with a constellation of silver thread. Her hair was curled and pinned in soft waves, a few tendrils loose like the woman she had become. Not perfect, but profoundly free. Across the garden, beneath a floral arch laced with jasmine and plum, Hwajun waited. In a dark tailored suit that made no statement but one: I belong only to her. His heart beat louder than the string quartet playing somewhere off to the side. His palms weren't sweaty, just still, unmoving, reverent. When Ivory stepped into view, time fractured. Everyone disappeared, and she smiled. Not the polite one for cameras, not the careful one for society. The real one. The one she saved just for him. She reached him, and he took her hand. They faced each other as the music softened, and the officiant stepped aside. No one else would speak. They had written their own vows, speak their own truth, seal what had never belonged to anyone but them. Hwajun reached into his jacket and unfolded a slip of cream parchment. His voice, when it came, was low, steady. I built empires, he began, to prove I didn't need love. I built walls to keep it out. I told myself power was enough. Legacy, name, control. He looked up at her. And then you smiled at me, and everything I'd built suddenly looked empty. Ivory's eyes shimmered, lips parted slightly as if holding back everything she couldn't say yet. Hwajun continued, You didn't enter my world by storm. You walked into it quietly, on worn shoes and steady feet. You didn't try to belong. You simply were. And in your presence, I found my soul's rest. He folded the paper, slid it back into his jacket pocket, and whispered, Just for her, you are my greatest empire. Ivory took a slow breath and pulled a small card from the folds of her gown. Her hand trembled, just once, but her voice didn't. I never thought this love was for me, she said, and the wind stirred her veil gently. I grew up in the corners of rooms meant for other girls and learned early how to make space without asking for any. She looked up at him. But you saw me, and then you let me stay. Not because I was the plan, not because I was perfect, but because somehow I was enough. Her eyes filled with tears now, and her smile curved like something earned. So I vow this, Hwajun Leang, I will love you in the silence, in the storm, in the moments when power falters and pride falls away. I will love the boy who learned to protect himself by building glass castles, and the man who finally opened the door. She lowered the card. You chose me. Now I choose you. Every day, freely, forever. A hush hung in the air. Then the officiant's voice, warm and clear. You may seal your vows. But Ivory was already leaning in. Their kiss wasn't grand. It wasn't hungry or frantic. It was simple and real, the way first kisses should have been, if not for all the things they had to survive first. His hands cradled her face like she was glass, but not fragile, precious. She kissed him back with the calm knowing of a woman no longer asking to be seen, but cherished, because she already is. As they pulled apart, the garden burst into gentle applause, but neither of them heard it. They were still lost in each other. Well, Ivory whispered, brushing her nose against his, no more borrowed names. No, Hwajun said, just the one you built, on love. And with her hand in his, under the soft glow of lanterns and the stars that watched from above, they stepped forward together, not into a spotlight, not onto a stage, but into a life that was truly, finally, theirs. 4 years later, the laughter of a child floated through the warm spring air like music. It wound through the low-hanging plum blossoms, skipped over stone pathways, and danced through jasmine vines trailing along the railing. Somewhere near the back of the garden, tiny feet pounded across stone tiles, sandals abandoned, curls bouncing in every direction. Mama, look, the little girl called, holding up a crooked crown of peony petals. Ivory smiled from her seat beneath the trellis. Her daughter's dress was stained with grass, her cheeks dusted with soil, and her eyes lit with the kind of joy that made all the noise in the world fall quiet. You made that for me? Ivory asked, holding out her hands. Nope, the girl giggled. For Daddy. From across the garden, Hwajun looked up from the jasmine bush he was pruning. For me? He asked, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. I must be very special. The little girl nodded with exaggerated seriousness and toddled toward him, crown in hand. He bent low, kneeling as she placed it on his head. It barely balanced on his dark hair, but he wore it like a crown made of diamonds. Ivory leaned her head against the wooden beam behind her, exhaling slowly. Time had passed in such strange, quiet ways. She hadn't meant to stay in Shanghai forever. At first, it was only until the scandal died. The silence between her and Hwajun turned into something stable, something kind. But the city had become more than location. It had become the garden they both needed. Something grown, not built. She reached into the side table drawer and pulled out the envelope that had arrived earlier. Melissa's handwriting was still elegant, still slanted in that perfect way that made it seem like even her ink had an attitude. Inside was a photo of Mateo, older now, holding a toy ship, smiling with crooked teeth, and a small note. Happy birthday to my favorite niece. Tell her I'm teaching her cousin how to paint peonies. He's hopeless at it. Love, Mel. Ivory smiled. She didn't always reply. Sometimes, healing meant knowing when not to reopen old chapters. But she was grateful. Grateful that even the most broken things could find new shapes, new roles. new peace. Huajun walked over and knelt beside her chair, placing the crown, now slightly crushed, on her head. "You're the real royalty," he said, brushing a kiss to her cheek. "Always were." She laughed softly. "I thought I was just the wildflower that wandered in." He looked at her, longer this time, deeper. "You never wandered. You claimed." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers with his. "I used to wonder if I belonged," she whispered. He didn't answer at first. He simply leaned in, pressed his lips to her forehead, and let them linger there like a vow made in silence. Then he said, "You don't belong to this world, Ivory. It belongs to you." The wind stirred gently around them, carrying the scent of jasmine and old memories. Their daughter giggled again and ran past, arms spread like wings. And Ivory closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the afternoon settle in her chest. She wasn't standing in anyone's shadow, not anymore. This garden, this man, this life, every inch of it bloomed from choices made in fire, in faith, in fierce, unwavering love. And now, she walked through it like a queen. The end.